All right, the big debate. And this might be like a part one, or I don't know. But the big debate, a center pin versus a spinning rod versus a bait casting rod. You know, we see these Midwest guys using center pins. I got a center pin about 2 years ago. Not a high-end one, just kind of a lower class center pin. It's a blood run rod with a Raven Helix reel. So about a $200 rod, $200 reel. So not super expensive. You know, kind of the same as any other combo I'd buy to get into steelhead fishing, around $400 for a combo, and you get a pretty decent setup. Obviously, center pins can be way up there, just like a spinning reel or a bait casting rod and reel, right? You can go wherever you want, right? But as an entry-level setup, I have loved it. Honestly, I personally think that a center pin in most cases is better than a bait caster and a spinning rod, and I will explain. Alright, so why I think a center pin actually is better is obviously because the drift. You know, and this is an argument like, do you really get a good drift? I could do the same exact thing with a bait caster. Now, a bait caster is very close. If I had to rate them, it would be spinning rod in last place. The issue with a spinning rod is you're always fumbling with the reel, right? You're throwing it out there, you're flipping the bail over, you're mending it, then you got to flip the bail, dump some line off, and usually unless you're in like faster current, you got to kind of work the rod, right? Flip the bail, you got to kind of work the rod, dump some line off of there, and then you got to flip it, pick up a little bit of line, dump some line. So to really have a good drift, you've got to constantly be working. And I'm actually teaching my younger siblings. I've been taking them fishing a lot lately, and that's kind of one thing they've had to learn too, is like they're not that great at casting a bait caster, but they'd almost rather fish a bait caster because of the ease of when you're drifting. You don't have to flip the bail over and worry about that. And when the bobber goes down, you're always out of position, the bail's always open, and the first thing you want to do is set the hook, and you got a bail open, you got line everywhere. So you have to close that bail, try to pick up some slack. And a lot of times, and I don't know if I have any footage saved because I film stuff and then I delete stuff and then it gets lost on memory cards and whatnot, but I have footage. And you guys, if you watch some of my other videos, you might notice, like there's one where I was springer fishing, right? And I think we caught some summer steelhead that day too. I don't know which video it was, but you can see the bobber down in the video, and this was with a bait caster. And I'm talking a spinning reel, which I think is even slower. But even with a bait caster, you can watch that bobber go down, and the human reaction time, you know, is about, they say, 2 to 3 seconds. Now, I'm not gonna, you know, write that down and say that's exactly it, but I've heard somewhere between like 2 and 3 seconds is our reaction time, right? You hear that when you're like in driving school and stuff, like, you know, stay 3 seconds off of, you know, the person in front of you because it takes that long to react. So when we see that float go down, a lot of times it already takes some time for us to react. Now we have to, with that spinning reel, flip the bail, pick up line, and then set the hook. A lot of times you're dumping out line. If you flip the bail and set the hook, you're not even getting a hook set because you have line dumped out, so you're not even getting tight on that fish really. So that's why a lot of times you see people will set the hook and they'll have the fish on for just a second, the fish might turn over, roll, and then it's gone. And that's because you weren't tight to the fish a lot of times. Now it can also be how the fish bite in other scenarios, but a lot of times that's what will happen, right? If you just kind of barely sting that fish, he doesn't get a good hook in him, he rolls over, the hook comes out because you never really had that fish stuck. Now, bait caster. A bait caster is very close to a center pin, but it's not quite there. And I'll tell you why. So, same thing with a bait caster, right? A lot of times you have a little more line on the water, not as bad as a spinning reel. And then when that bobber goes down, same thing. It's like, you gotta click over the reel up the slack, set the hook. Right? Which, at a bait caster is way faster. They got much faster gear ratios. I fish Curados, Shimano Curado Ks a lot. And I use like an 8, I don't know what they are, 8 to 5 gear ratio or something crazy like that. My lowest one I think is a 7.2. So they're faster gear ratios. So it doesn't take much, right? A crank or two and you're already tight to the fish. So it's not as bad as a spinning reel, which most spinning reels are lower, either a 6.3 or like a 5 whatever, 561. Most spinning reels are pretty slow. There are making some faster ones nowadays, but typical spinning reels are pretty slow. So anyway, the bait caster, you don't have to worry about flipping the bail. All you got to do is turn the handle, and it clicks, and then a couple cranks, and usually you're tight. But with a bait caster, when I'm drifting, I still don't get that perfect drift. And you guys might say, well, why? Because I can feed off my line right off the spool. But a lot of times if you're fishing especially lower flows, or you got like faster current, then you got slower current on the other side, a lot of times what'll happen is that line isn't coming off your spool smooth enough to actually pull out that line without affecting your bobber, right? If I throw out there and just hold my rod like this, the line's not actually going to come off. I've got to either kind of work my rod a little bit or pull it off like this. Now in faster water, faster run or whatever, I might be able to toss it out there and not do anything. But you've got to work it still, right? You got to be kind of pulling line off, and you still get this bow on the water, right? Your line's still laying on the water bowing because you're working that rod, you're trying to dump line out to get that smooth drift. Well, now I have to mend a bunch because I got this line out, right? And then I've got to pick up some line, I've got to dump out some line to try and keep that float in the zone, because every time I mend and try to move my rod, it's going to pull that float out of the zone, right? And you might not even realize it a lot of times, but a lot of times I notice with people, they're cast all the way across the river, right? Their bobber starts on the other side of the river in the run or in the seam, and they give it a mend. Well, you just pulled that bobber, a few inches this way. Then they go down, they got to give it a mend. You pulled your bobber a little bit, and you don't even notice because you're just pulling it so slightly. But it's like by the time your bobber actually finishes the drift, you cast it in the seam, and now you're out here. So you pulled that bait away from that fish. And even when you're not moving your bobber much, every time that bobber bobbles and moves, your bait down there, sometimes I do say it can get you bit because it'll give your bead or your jig a little bit different action, and sometimes it'll cause a reaction bite from fish. But a lot of times you just pulled it away from them. They're sitting there, you mend it, and now your jig or your bead was coming down, you pulled that float a little bit, whoop, and that bead or jig just lifted right up away from that steelhead or salmon, and now you're done, right? Now you just pulled it right away from him. So a bait caster, although it's almost there, it still isn't quite that perfect drift. Now a centerpin, it is such an amazing setup because that spool is 100% free spinning. And I'm actually gonna go grab mine. All right, so I grabbed my pin setup, right? So like I said earlier, this is a blood run rod, Raven Helix reel, like a $200 reel, $200 rod. So not the fanciest setup, but it's worked really well for me. I've caught a lot of fish on it. Now, with this reel, as you guys see, it is free spinning, 100% free spinning. Now, where you go with the expensive reels, the more expensive you get, the better bearings are in this reel. The easier it spins, the faster startup, right? You barely have to touch it and it'll spin. This one's adjustable. I can loosen up the screw and that makes it spin even easier, right? So now I barely touch it and it'll spin. So what that does, because it's so easy to spin, is you're always connected to your float, right? You toss it out there and you're always direct tight to your float, and it's always just coming off your spool. You're not dumping out line, you're not pulling out line, you're not flipping a bail and feeding line out. It literally is always tight on your spool. Now if you make a longer drift and a longer cast, you still have a little bit of line on the water. But with a centerpin rod, and they started making spinning and bait casting rods this long too, but normally in the Pacific Northwest, a typical spinning or bait casting rod for float fishing is between 9.5 and at longest a 10.5 foot rod. There are some companies that are making some like 12 and 13 foot spinning rods, but they're not that popular. This is a 13 foot rod. And some of you might be like, whoa, that is crazy, but until you've tried it, you don't know what you're missing. Because I can flip this out there, right? And we're not gonna go into casting, but flip it out there very easily. And I hold that rod up and everything is tight to my spool. That line's going down to my bobber tight. As soon as that float goes down, I don't have to reel because I'm already so tight to my float. All I got to do is put my finger here, which stops this from spinning, and lift up. A lot of times you don't even need to do a hard hook set because you're so tight. It's just lifting up. That rod will bend over right into that fish, and you've got. There's another one. Oh my gosh. No way. Fish on. Next cast. And you guys may have seen that if you've watched some of my videos where I'm fishing the centerpin. So as far as drifting and not missing fish, you know, I rarely miss fish with this rod. I rarely miss bobber downs. The only time I miss them is when the fish don't eat the bait that good. I'm fishing beads and they're nipping at it or whatever. But if I've got like eggs on here, a shrimp, jig, I've got a bobber and jig, every time that bobber goes down, I'm right there, I'm on it, I've got that fish, it's over. From there, obviously, then it's just a fun fight on this light rod, which, again, this being a 6 to 10 pound, so I use it in like smaller creeks, lower flows, for, you know, hatchery steelhead most of the time, right? I'm not going to take this setup to a bigger river and hook big giant steelhead on it. I actually took it to a river where I was like, oh, I'm gonna be coho fishing. Wrong, it was full of chum, and I ended up shattering this rod later on in the day and getting my butt kicked by some chum, which honestly this reel has eggs all over it right now, so it's not spinning that great. Need to clean it up, oil it up, and get it ready for steelhead because it's time. Now, where was I? So anyway, that free spinning spool allows you to stay tight, right? I can tuck it like this and I'm tight to that float all the time, and I don't have to do anything. I don't have to feed it line, I don't have to do anything because this reel is just so touchy and spins so easily. And the other thing is I'm running mono. And I haven't ever fished mono on a bait caster. I mean, obviously when I was younger, but when I got into float fishing, it was all braid. Everyone's like braided line. So that's what you use because you don't ever lose floats if you're fishing braided line, right? The only thing you lose is your leaders really, unless you get your bobber weight stuck really bad. But so I don't know, you know, if you tried mono on a bait caster, it might come off the reel smoother and through the guide smoother, and you might get a tighter float to your reel. But I don't know. But I do know running mono or some kind of floating like copolymer, monofilament, right, on the pin. This is 15 on here right now. When I'm fishing my steelhead rivers, usually, like I said, I'm fishing a little bit lower clear water with this setup. I'll run like 10 pound mono on here for my main line and run like 8 or even 6 pound leader. And you guys are like, oh, that's crazy, but with this 13-foot, 6 to 10 pound rod, I've landed some big Chinook on light gear. It takes a while, but you don't have to worry about it breaking because the setup is just, it's so soft, and it's just a fun way to fight fish. Anyway, I keep getting on these rabbit trails. So the mono on here also, I think, really helps coming off that reel super smooth. Going through the guides really smooth, because I do notice, like my Lamiglass SI bait casting rod, if I'm using like 40 or 50 pound braided line on my float setup, that line will catch going through those guides, and a lot of times, and not like enough to where it's like, oh, it's caught, but it just slows that float down a little bit, and it's like you got to work the rod a little bit to get that line to go through. Whereas this mono with really smooth guides just slides right through, and you're always tight to your float. As soon as it goes down, I'm there. I stick those fish every time. Now with a bead, like I said, it's a different story. If they're short biting a bead, you know, you might as well give up and go home, because we all know when they're biting beads finicky, it can be tough landing fish. So that's just bead fishing. But when they're eating beads good, or if I got a jig or worm or bait, I stick these fish and I'm landing most of them unless I break them off like an idiot. So that is my take on a spinning versus bait caster versus a center pin. If you've got a comeback for me, comment down below. I want to hear it, and I'll probably make a video and try to come back at you. And it's just for fun. You know, everyone's always, they get really, you know, their panties in a wad for say, over, well, you know, this is why this is better to fish. And it's like, honestly, I don't care. Fish whatever you want. Fish whatever is comfortable to you, whatever you can cast good. Because learning to cast with a center pin is a little bit challenging. And I'm not going to say that I can't cast this in the same spots that I can cast a bait caster, but there are certain scenarios where it's tougher to cast this, where if I had a spinning rod, I could just zip it over there. So sometimes you do get a little tougher situations, but I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I'm like, oh, I just can't fish this hole because I can't cast with the center pin. It just might be a little bit tougher, or I might have to get a little creative with where I stand on the bank and trees and stuff like that. But yeah, you can pretty much cast the same distance with this as I could with a spinning rod. It also just depends on the float. If I'm running a little tiny 7-gram fixed float, obviously I can't expect to throw across the giant river. But if I'm fishing a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce sliding float, normal steelhead setup, I can throw it just as far as I can with a bait caster or spinning rod most of the time. So anyway, let me hear your feedback, your comeback, and maybe I'll make a couple more of these videos, kind of make a series about center pin versus spinning versus bait casting. And we'll see how many people actually watch this video of me just rambling on.